So a very warm welcome again for those of you who have been with us from Dr. Shear's presentation to session one, either with Janice, Doug, or Babalwa and Amina. Some of you just came from our breakout discussion groups, and these are a couple things that I heard folks say that were really striking. Folks shared, I came to these sessions to learn about my clients, but I ended up learning about myself. And someone also said, these were the conversations I didn't need to know that I needed to have. So already so powerful in this day. And we're incredibly excited, again, as I said, to have our House Grief Support Center. My name is Leora. I'm your host for this session. And I am the Pacific Southwest MHTTC School Mental Health Lead. And I'm going to be doing a couple housekeeping items, and then we're going to quickly go to Talia and Lauren so that we can get into our learning. So before we move forward, I want to be really clear. This is the evidence-based and culturally defined track, but if that doesn't mean anything to you, but the content is what was interesting, excellent. You are in, there is no wrong room to come to. You are in the place you need to be. Just like Donna did in the chat box, if you can put your name, but also include your role and your location in the chat box. So I might need help from Joanne to maybe include that prompt. So if you can put in the chat box your name and your role and your location. Thank you, Tiana. Or Tiana, I don't know how you pronounce your name, and Beatrice. Oh, Project Aware Director from South Carolina. Welcome. We're excited to see you. Welcome, welcome. So this really helps us all feel connected. We're seeing people from Iowa and from Michigan, from Tennessee come in. Thank you. So if you're just joining us, if you can please put your name and your role and your location in the chat box, that is really helpful. Again, we welcome you to building virtual communities to support grieving youth and families during these uncertain times with our House Grief Support Center. Talia, let's move forward. Great. So a couple of housekeeping items. The first is that if this is your first session with us, this might feel new to you, but if this was your second session, you're old pros at this point. Everyone will be muted and won't be. Okay, I'm back. So sorry. Thank you for your patience. Isn't that a fun thing to get kicked out when you're talking about housekeeping? It's very meta. For those of you who are not in California, you may know that California's internet right now is a little bit strange because of wildfires. So I appreciate your patience with that blip. Where was I? Yes, if you have a comment, if you can please put it in the chat box. We're going to have a brief survey at the end for you to take and complete. And that this event is also closed captioned. We wanted to make it accessible to those of you who would benefit from closed captioning. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, the Zoom bar, you'll be able to click on closed caption and we'll be able to access subtitles. If you do not want closed caption, you can click on that and then make sure that your settings are on not subtitle. And I want to do a very big thank you to Kathleen, who is our captioner. It's very hard work. Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, Talia, move ahead, please. Thank you. So we actually just created, and Andrea's on, this is Andrea's gift to all of us. The National MHTTC Network just created fact sheets for you on defining grief, responses across lifespan, preventive and protective, cultural responsiveness, and evidence-based treatments. They can all be found on our main website that you see on your screen, and we will also make sure that you get that in a follow-up email. So those are great resources for you. Talia, move forward. Thank you. And we also know that both this content and sitting in a full day talking about grief can bring up a lot for us. So if any of you are feeling overwhelmed, if you are needing support, we've got some hotlines for you, and we really, really encourage you to not feel shy or shamed for reaching out. This is a big thing. This is a really big thing. And we also encourage you to stretch and stand and get your body moving, drinking lots of water. I'll show you mine right here. So really encourage you to be grief sensitive in your grief sensitive learning. Next slide. If you are new to us at the MHTTCs, we welcome you. We are a national collaborative of 10 sites and 2 regional centers and 1 national coordinating office that provides no cost technical assistance related to the mental health and school mental health workforce. And this Grief Sensitive Virtual Learning Institute, GSVLI, if you needed another acronym in your canon, is here as a collective output of all MHTTCs across the country. Next slide. So this is the visual. Myself and Joanne, who is our distance learning manager and supporting us on tech today, we are from the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, but many of you are from across the country. You're from other MHTTCs. So if you have not yet connected with your regional MHTTC, we really encourage you to do so. I'm going to moving ahead. We are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and while we are definitely supported by our funder, we know that not all views expressed in this session or during the Institute are expressly of the Assistant Secretary or of SAMHSA. So consider ourselves disclaimed. Next slide. And this is where I end. I'm going to toss it over to Talia and Lauren so you can introduce yourselves. I'm a big fan of presenters being able to introduce themselves rather than me reading off a slide. But again, I'm going to encourage you, if you have comments or haven't checked in yet, and let us know who you are, if you can please put that in the chat box. And any questions for the presenters, I will be monitoring, and we'll get to Q&A. And I just want to say, before I toss it over, as someone who lives in California, our house is a thought leader, a field leader. They're an incredible grief support center and an incredible staff who provides numerous impacts to the field. And so we're really, really grateful, Lauren and Talia, for you taking your time and sharing your own learning and your leadership learning as it relates to providing client care. Thank you. Take it away.
Okay, well, feel very grateful to have this opportunity to be here with all of you, and it's so exciting to be with people from all over the country. I'm Lauren Schneider. I'm the clinical director of the children's programs here at our house, and we'll tell you in a minute what all of our various programs are, but I'll let you introduce yourself, Talia.
Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you so much for having us and joining us together virtually. I work with Lauren at our house, and I'm the associate coordinator of our Camp Erin, and our in-house program for children and teens.
So I know you had a lot of choices of what you wanted to be doing during this slot, but what we're going to be doing with you today is telling you about first how we responded when on March 15th we had to go into this kind of overcome the shock of the lockdown that our mayor put us on and our governor very early in the pandemic here in California and in Los Angeles in particular. So we want to share with you how we rebooted all of our programs, and then we'll get into some beginnings on children's grief specifically and how COVID is impacting the grieving process for children. And then we'll go more deeply into that with you in November. But just really quickly about our house, and I hope you have a place like our house in your communities, but we're a full service grief support center and we are not a mental health center. We don't do therapy at our house. All our programs, whether they're for children or adults, are support programs, not therapy. And they are primarily administered or facilitated by our volunteers who are trained to do very therapeutic grief groups with children or adults who are grieving a death of someone very close to them. So, and we'll go through the 3 children's programs for this presentation specifically with you. So I hope you can read this slide. I found it pretty early in the pandemic when we were all just getting used to a lot of new social norms, like even just, was it called the coronavirus or do we call it COVID-19? And just learning new behaviors. Who could you touch or what could you touch? What did you have to wipe down? And just everything, just relearning kind of how to be even within our own homes, and certainly when we set foot outside of our homes. And that was not easy. It was not an easy process. And in the workplace, it was even harder. And we were supporting grievers who, they were already grieving, and all of a sudden the rest of the country and the rest of the world were being impacted by death too. So they weren't alone anymore in this grief landscape. And we were very concerned about our grievers. But just to give you an idea, for those of you that don't work with grievers every day like we do, in the country, 1 in 14 children by the age of 18 will experience the death of a parent or sibling. Now, with the advent of COVID, Catherine shared a statistic. We don't know how that's going to change. That figure comes from the the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, which is a model out of Judy's house in Colorado. And it's through 2018. And we know that number is going to look very different for 2020. But as of this week, we're at 190,000 people who have died due to COVID. And for every one person who has died due to COVID, there are 9 people who are experiencing a death of somebody in their kinship network, meaning grandparent, parent, sibling, child, or spouse. So now if we multiply that 190,000 people by 9, that means 1.7 million people are grieving today. So the need for grief support is so intense, and it's so great that you're doing everything you can to educate yourself how to support grievers in your own communities. And a big part of our mission at our house is to help people, support the grievers in their own communities with this kind of education. Okay, Talia. So we know, especially here in California, but all over the country, that the impact of COVID is not equal. It's not affecting everybody equally, but it's especially impacting Black, Brown, and essential workers in a very unequal, unfair way. But for all people who are being impacted by the ravages of this disease, we know that for children, they're impacted on a daily basis by having, in most cases right now, to do their learning remotely. And so for grieving children, being disconnected from friends and peer support that they would get if they were on campus in school is a serious problem. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in shortly. Even if it's not their direct parent or guardian that's one generation removed, it might be an elder in their family. That person could be their primary caregiver, or the person who does their after school care. So when a grandparent or an elder in the family dies, often there's a multi-generational family or an extended kinship network that's directly impacting the child. And whether anyone dies in that kinship network, the caregivers of the child are grieving, so they're not the same caregiver they were. before they became bereaved by COVID or any other cause of death. And then, of course, the other significant ways COVID is impacting our children and that is affecting them is the way the unemployment due to the shutdown of so many businesses like restaurants. We still don't have dine-in restaurants here in Los Angeles, or we still can't go to gyms here. Inequity in access to healthcare is a big problem. Food insecurity and homelessness in our community and in many of your communities because of COVID is a big problem too, impacting our children and their ability to learn and social and emotional well-being. Okay, Talia.
So we wanted to establish some common definition of what grief is. Everyone joining us today has their own perspective, maybe from life experience or clients that they've worked with. And for us, we wanted to share first and foremost how we talk about grief with our children at our house and the teens at our house. And we think and we share with them that grief is the thoughts and feelings and behaviors, a whole range of those, that someone feels after someone close to them has died. And that's how we explain it to our teens. And we might ask, what do you think others who come to our house would say when we ask them what grief is, to get them talking in the beginning of their, first experience at our house. And we talk about that range and what that looks like. The other layer that we want to share today, which is so present in all of our minds and in other presentations you might have been to today as well, are the feelings of loss associated with the pandemic. Lauren just touched on a few, and that's really compounding our grievers' feelings of loss and what they've already gone through prior to the pandemic or maybe during the pandemic, now having all these resources and community and connection taken away from them. And the third layer that we want to talk about are the reactions to those who have been killed and lives lost to racial and social injustice, which has been a landscape, a part of our conversation for quite some time now, but really at the forefront of a lot of our minds with the recent news of too many Americans dying due to racial and social injustice. So those three layers are what we'll talk about when we say grief here in this presentation. And again, the context that you are each coming with, really keep that in mind as well. You bring to the table all of those life experiences that you've had that help you understand what grief is. So what to do? We have all this grief, our kids, our family, our community are grieving. What to do? What's a social worker to do? Sometimes in the office, we feel like this image a bit, where do we turn? Should we just pull our hair out? Where are we? At our house, we have 3 programs within our child and teen program. And that is our school-based grief groups, where we go into the schools, now via Zoom, navigating that, but run grief groups for elementary through high school students. We have in-house programming, which is for students, or for children, I should say, who are either experiencing the death of a parent or now a sibling, and our Camp Aaron LA. So for today, we're really going to talk about these 3 programs, how we adapted in COVID, and what lessons we learned through that experience.
Okay, and just to be honest with you and really transparent, when all this started, I adopted a saying that it really felt to me, and I own this, like we were dragging boulders up a hill to have to transform our program. It was a burden like I had never felt in my career of working with grieving children for 25 years. And it almost felt insurmountable at times. But we weren't going to give up because we're so committed to serving grieving children. But it was a really, really difficult task to have these 3. It was the start of our camp season. We were in the middle of the school semester, and we had 2 offices full of grief groups for kids. So we had to drag this boulder, up the hill every day, and we were shorthanded, and we had staff layoffs because of the economic downturn. So, and I'm sure for you, you experienced a lot of the same challenges in your workplace too. So I just want you to know that we were like a four-legged animal operating with three legs, basically. So we'll talk about our school program too. We have Los Angeles has the second largest school system in the nation after New York. And it was second semester of the school year. And we had probably 30 groups, I would say, started. And all of a sudden, it was like radio silence just across the board. And what we knew was happening was the total focus of the school system turned to feeding all of these children who counted on their schools to give them 2 meals a day. So LAUSD, LA Unified School District, took on the task of getting food to the children in our schools, and actually provided food to whoever showed up at those sites where food was being given out. I don't know how many meals we gave out. It was a huge number, at least 500,000 meals. I think 400,000 is the figure that's just popped in my head, but close to 500,000 meals were given out in the spring. And then also getting tablets to all the children. The poverty level is the typical socioeconomic status of the majority of students in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And many of the children come from families where the grown-ups are essential workers. So we knew that our children were going to be impacted. Our children who were participating in our groups already, who were meaning they were already grieving, might experience an additional death due to COVID in the coming months. So what we couldn't do was expect for our groups to suddenly go online, because our partners at the schools were overwhelmed just trying to feed and get the kids to continue their education. And so we didn't ask anything of them, but what we did instead was try to provide them with some resources. So we created a toolkit for them filled with things that we thought would help them be supportive of families who might suddenly become bereaved because of another death, and also support the grievers that they were already dealing with on their campuses, since we weren't going to be there on a weekly basis doing our groups for the time being at least. So we created this toolkit, which is available if anybody would like it. We can make that available for you as well. Of all the school groups that we had going, only 2 schools out of about 30 actually asked us to complete groups that semester. The rest were too overwhelmed. But we did start preparing for this fall semester that has just started now by training all of our group leaders how to do groups on Zoom. And then we spent the summer converting our 10-week curriculum to an online format, meaning changing the activities that we normally do in person by handing out worksheets and handing out supplies and all of that type of thing, rethinking it and converting it into a format that could be used virtually. So doing everything we could to be prepared when the schools returned. And much to our surprise, we didn't know how quickly they would be able to turn their attention this fall to initiating the process of opening groups on their campuses, but they really have been doing it, and we're pretty much where we normally would be at this time every year, with I think about 30 schools already in the process of identifying students and requesting groups, only they're going to be online instead of in person, using our resources, our curriculum, and our trained group leaders to do it in a Zoom format. So it is possible. It takes preparation, but the schools want it. They still are prioritizing grief, even though there's all these other social and emotional and even physical, like food needs that the children have in the school systems. They are prioritizing grief, which is a huge relief to us, because what we were afraid of was that grief would fall down to the bottom of the pile of those social and emotional needs. So hopefully that will give you the encouragement that you'll need to, to call your schools and say, hey, we're here. We want to do this for you as well. And we're also training their staff and volunteers on how to, to support grieving students on their campuses. Okay, and I hope you're putting questions in the chat. Now, this is a very powerful image. I'm going to stop talking for 10 seconds so you can just feel what this image provokes in you. Okay, so I wish we were in person so I could see your hands raised and call on you, but we don't have time for that. What this image represented to Talia and I was the fact that the children were out there and are assigned to 10 grief groups at the start of the lockdown in Los Angeles. And we wanted them to continue in their grief groups. They love their going to groups, seeing their friends. It's every other week. But there was a problem in that, Whoopie, runaway slides. The problem was we couldn't get their grown-ups to respond to anything. We tried to reach them by telephone, by email, by text message, and they just weren't responding to us. And what we learned really quickly was that they were on a state of total overwhelm. And this was because they had to adapt to this new remote learning format. Many of them were working from home at the same time on their professional jobs, not to mention their jobs within the home. And to make it worse, they were single parents because all of them had lost either a spouse or the other parent of the children. Okay, so they were now single parenting. They were single parenting already, let's say. And so all of this was just made harder by the fact that they were already grieving. In addition to these new stressors in their life that all the non-bereaved parents had to deal with. And they had to figure out how to get groceries in their house and toilet paper and paper towels, like all of us and all of you out there listening to us had to do too. So they were on total overwhelm. So what we had to do was figure out how we were going to get these kids back to group. And we also knew a couple things about grieving kids, and that was that one of the things that they always do is idealize the person who died. They have them up on a pedestal, whether you're an adult griever or a child griever. some part of the first year, the person who died is on a pedestal. And for children, they're always thinking that the one who died was the fun one, and that for them, they were thinking this would be easier if mom or dad were here. You know, if they were the ones that were here, being home, you know, all the time and not being able to see their friends, or not being able to go to school and get out of the house and get away from that parent that they were, or guardian that they were stuck with, would somehow have been easier. So there was a lot of suffering going on in these families. And, you know, and it was really hard for us to just stand by and not be able to reach them. So some of the things that we started to do was, one thing that we started to do, and I thank you, Talia, you're reading my mind as usual, was figure out new ways to communicate with them. And these included, we created what we called our family bulletin board. This is on our website. We invite you to visit it. On the family bulletin board, what we started like a story time function. You can see Talia reading a book on there. We've been rotating books every month, so they can visit the website and have a story, a grief book read to their children. That would give them a break for a little period of time, because their child can listen to a story. We have COVID-related resources there. So I'll show you some of those resources in a minute. So we created the family bulletin board. We started sending a text reminder and an email reminder to get before every group, the day of and the day before. And we weren't doing that before, but we know they need extra reminders because they've got so much extra stuff going on in their brains. So we took it upon ourselves to go that extra mile. And now as therapists, you're thinking, oh, well, then you're doing all the work. Well, we forgot, all, you know, we put all of our clinical, you know, boundaries aside for a while when it comes to working harder than our clients sometimes. And we said, no, this is what we need to do. They really need extra help right now. And it did make a difference. We also made phone calls to for people that we weren't seeing to find out what was going on and whether they still wanted to participate, and gave them lots and lots and lots of chances, you know, to make it to group. We worked with our group leaders too, training them for the in-house groups, how to do Zoom groups, converting curriculum again, but importantly, adjusting expectations. So kids do not have the attention span on Zoom that they have in person. You don't have the same verbal cues that you have in person. You can't read those verbal and social cues as easily. So we had to develop new verbal cues, like ways to send encouragement, you know, using little hand signals and stuff that we'll share more next time. But really adjusting the group leaders' expectations of how kids are going to behave, how deep they're going to share in group too, and even how long groups were going to last, that they weren't going to last as long as they did in person, and who's going to attend, that if they had 2 kids, that was going to be a group, even though normally they would have 6 kids, that we were going to be happy if we could provide support for whoever showed up in group. And little by little, people started coming back, and their behavior actually started being more focused and more interactive, and they started sharing on a deeper level as they became more used to these new norms and routines and so forth. So it met our expectations, actually exceeded our expectations in some ways, but not all the time. Like, for instance, I'll share with you, a disappointment. Last night we had a girl starting a teen group, very high expectations. She was so excited to be joining group, and no one else came on Zoom. She was the only one that showed up, but she stayed for an entire hour with her group leaders and enjoyed their support. And she'll come back next time because they told her about what group normally feels like when the other group members are there. So sometimes it meets our expectations and sometimes it doesn't. And so we need to have realistic expectations of Zoom, online groups. Okay, Talia. So some resources I'd like, or we'd like you to know about that we found that you can also access. This book, Trinka and Sam Fighting the Big Virus, that comes from the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. So that is a very helpful website. It's a national resource, obviously. I'll say it again, National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and they have other great resources, but that's a wonderful book to read with children. The National Alliance for Grieving Children created this good workbook that another toolkit for families responding to change and loss. We created handouts specific to COVID that we have posted on our website as well, including preparing children for funerals, because funerals are different. All right, let's go on. Okay, Talia.
Our next big decision came when we started thinking about camp. So we typically run 2 weekend-long camps, Camp Erin LA, which is part of a network of bereavement camps through the Aluna network. And as March, we're looking right into June and thinking what to do with our campers, knowing that the time of COVID-19 is creating increased isolation for our kids. We were sort of fighting with ourselves, knowing that our program, Camp Erin, does that exact opposite. It reduces that sense of isolation, it normalizes those feelings of grief for our kids and our teens. And we really grappled with the fact that we most likely weren't going to be able to put camp on in the way we typically do, but how do we still meet those needs that we know are still present in our grievers? So one thing that we did was connect with the National Alliance for Grieving Children. We sat on many, many weekly calls, which kept our finger on the pulse of what things were happening nationally, which was both motivating and humbling and kind of all mixed in one about where do we fit in that? What can we do for our grievers here in LA? And eventually we decided to cancel our June session, push all those campers into our August session, which we held on hope for. But at some point we realized that was just not going to happen either in person. So we sat with the disappointment, just like we know our campers did. There were layers of disappointment. For us as staff, this isn't time that really fuels our year. We are excited and motivated by camp. Our volunteers, who are a tremendous resource and support for our organization. For those of you who work with volunteers, or maybe you yourself are a volunteer at a grief support agency, you know that you are instrumental in having these programs run as smoothly and with such care and compassion. So we knew that there was a lot of disappointment and a lot of grief all around, knowing we had to cancel camp. One of the beauties of camp is how quickly you can see that transformation in our kids and that community build. And that was something that was very important for us to figure out how to replicate. So then we went to the drawing board. How do we replicate our goals of camp, which is reducing isolation for our kids and teens, normalizing their grief feelings, and helping them build that community for themselves, which feels very different to them than communities with their non-bereaved peers. How did we do that on Zoom, or how could we do that on Zoom? So first, we all just had to be sad for a little bit. We were sad, our volunteers were sad. So we held a volunteer summit and we collectively shared what that grief was for us, right? We're talking about those layers of grief and losses due to the pandemic. This felt like a real big one to our team and to our volunteers, and of course to our campers, which hopefully we made it up to them, but we'll see. And And then we had to redesign our program. And what we did is we condensed our programming to a 2.5-hour block of time on Zoom. We created a camp in a box, which we sent to all of our campers to help bring some of that excitement, a camp t-shirt and name tag, some snacks, and all the materials they would need for the day of camp. Moving on to training our volunteers so that they felt prepared to lead via Zoom. And then the big one, engaging campers on an online platform and what that would look like for camp. And that actually starts right at the beginning of the process with our interviews. So when this initially happened, our knee-jerk reaction was, wait, if transportation is usually a big barrier and that's now gone, can we now open it up to even more kids? Can we make an open Zoom link? How does this work with access? But really, we thought carefully about how important it was to have real intentional assessments via Zoom to make sure that since we couldn't reach through the screen and support every grieving child like we would in person, how do we safely onboard campers in a way that's still meaningful and contained in that Zoom format? So engaging campers started all the way at the beginning with we call them camp interviews, orientations, where we have a bit of an assessment there. So recap, what did we learn from adaptation of these 3 programs? The first thing we want to share first and foremost is that it works. Zoom, online, whatever, Google Classroom, whatever platform you're using, it still works to connect grieving children. And really, if you put in the work on our end, we realize, just like we did before in our in-person groups and meetings in camp, the kids really do all the hard work. They do all the heavy lifting. So if you build it, if you create it, even via Zoom, we realize that the need for kids to connect to each other who have had the same experience, that inherent need takes precedent over all the other worries and barriers that we thought would be there. Zoom fatigue, fear of sharing on a screen with new people, right? Sitting in your room and maybe someone's walking by and that feels uncomfortable. All of those worries that we outline and brainstorm for ourselves dissipated a bit because that precedent really took place of kids wanting to connect with each other regardless of the platform. The other big lesson we learned is that their grown-ups, the adults in their families, really needed reassurance that there was something that could still be done for their kids during this time and that would still be a support to them. So we increased our parent and guardian nights where we would share resources, hold space for them to explain how their lives have been impacted, how their kids are now doing in the age of COVID-19, and really provided space for the whole family, the grievers and their parents, to connect in an online way. All right, back to you, Lauren.
Okay, so we do want to try now to give a quick overview of children's grief. I know a lot of you are working in the grief field, and so hopefully there will be some good takeaways for you still from this part of the presentation. So like Catherine Shearer said this morning, at our house we agree that we don't follow the stage model at our house. We don't believe that grief progresses in the same way for each griever in a linear fashion, but we have based our interventions always in the 26 years that we've been around on J. William Worden's task model, which is a nonlinear model. You see that illustrated on the left-hand side of your screen, which just describes tasks that grievers embark on at the time of their loved one's death, but work on continuously, really for the rest of their own lives. And then on the right side of the screen are what we've created as goals, or what you could use as a treatment plan in your own work with children. So we're going to go through these with you kind of fast and do it more thoroughly in the future. So the first goal then that corresponds with Warden's first task is really to help kids not just accept that the person died in their life, but understand what death means and what exactly caused the person that they love to be gone from their life. So of course this depends on, where they are, both cognitively and emotionally, according to developmental theories, and whether it's the first death they've experienced or not. Okay. Just really quickly, even infants grieve. Bowlby, who was the first to study grief and created his attachment theory out of his work with grievers, did recognize that even babies were grieving. And of course, what they're reacting to are changes in their caregiving environment. Let's go on. But toddlers, and even as young as 2-year-olds are, they need to be included in dialogue in the families, because they're learning language. Even if they don't know all the words that are being discussed initially, they do acquire language very, very young and are very aware of what's going on. But the problem with the toddlers, and we do take kids as young as 4 in our program, is that at that point in their cognitive development, they haven't progressed enough to think about death in a logical way. They're still magical in their thinking, and don't understand the concepts that make death understandable and allow them to grieve in the way that older children and adults can really grieve. So it makes it impossible for them to really get what's going on. So primarily, the most important part being they don't get that death is final, that the person who died is never coming back. And even if we tell them that, they're still not going to be able to understand finality until their brain achieves object permanence, which doesn't happen usually until around 5 or 6, or enough moments of knowing have accumulated, which does happen faster to bereaved children than non-bereaved children. They're very egocentric, and being magical thinkers both make it very likely that they're going to think that the death is their fault. So that also impacts grief for kids at this age. Okay. So what the most important thing for you to do if you have young kids, either in your own family or you're working with the family that has kids that are still preschool aged, is be truthful with them about death right from the start, and also use truthful meaning about the cause of death and that the person died, because people sometimes will say, oh no, he's on a business trip. People actually do stuff like that, and rather than tell young children that their person has died. And also always explain the cause of death truthfully, and not substitute some other cause because you think you have to protect children. But do it in an age-appropriate way, meaning tell them the truth in small amounts, titrating the amount of information you give them depending on their age. And it can be difficult to know what is age appropriate, and you as clinicians can help the family member determine what is age appropriate, or as a rule, tell them a little, ask them if they have any questions, and then answer whatever the child is asking, because that indicates that they're ready for more information. Okay, go on. Going to school-age children then, At this point, their brains have achieved object permanence, so they do understand that death is permanent and irreversible now, that once the person died, we will never see them alive again, which is key to grieving. They're very concrete thinkers. They're not thinking about death in abstract terms the way older teens and adults can. They don't yet have a great vocabulary for talking about what they're feeling yet. Even if they come from a family that talks about feelings, they're still learning how to do that. So they may be more likely to talk about their grief in terms of body symptoms, like to say, I have a tummy ache, or I have a headache, or I can't sleep, rather than to say, I'm really missing daddy right now, so I can't fall asleep. So, that's helpful to explain that to their grown-ups and teach them how to work with that. They have short sadness spans, and Zoom in particular, we see that happening. So, they may appear as though they're not really grieving. They look like every other non-bereaved kid when they're playing with friends at parks, or when they are able to go back to school. They may look like they're not grieving because they're also trying to fit in and not appear different from their peers. But they also can't focus for very long. So if you're doing sessions with grieving children, you might have to change activities 2 or 3 times and include standing activities and sitting activities and art and games and stories, and definitely not try and just sit and talk to them, or expect them to just sit and talk to you about what's going on. Okay, for teens, pre-adolescents and teens, so starting around, let's say around age 11 and up, they are then entering into Piaget's state of formal operations, so can think about death in very abstract terms, meaning like, how could God take my mom? She was the best person, the kindest, nicest. That's kind of abstract thinking. But they still lack the emotional maturity to grieve the way adults grieve, and are not able to process their grief in ways that keep them safe. So they may, choose to cope with their grief in very dangerous ways, and that's, so that makes them very at risk, and they need to be monitored for coping strategies that could be very dangerous. They're also magical thinkers, again, at this age, which means they may think that they're invincible. Even when peers are dying in their peer network, they still think that it can't happen to them. That's one of the hallmarks of the adolescent developmental phase. So even in the face of many peers dying, cousins, siblings even, they are still likely to engage in very high-risk activities and to use some of them to cope with their grief as distraction, etc. So we have to really monitor them and teach them coping skills that are going to be safe for them to use, instead of those more dangerous coping skills that they might rely on. Okay. Their development, according to Erickson, also is very impacted if they are experiencing a death during their teen years, especially, because they're being pulled outside their family, their nuclear family, and looking to get those needs met from a peer group. But one thing we know, especially from our teen grievers, is that they may not feel supported by their peers that were there for them before the death. That's one of the things we hear most often, is that they're disappointed by their peers, that they don't understand, and then actually feel abandoned by their peers who don't find them as fun as they used to be. So they need a new peer group to identify with, and that's why having a teen group offered at their school, whether it's on Zoom now or in person again eventually, or going to a grief camp like Camp Erin, is really important for them to have a chance to be with other teens that they can connect to and establish a new teen group that really understand what it feels like to have someone you love die when you're a teenager. And you, as one last point back there, Talia, is that you as their therapist or social worker, you want to also empower them to get their needs on the separation individuation continuum. They might get pulled back into the family to help with paying bills and babysitting and all those things, especially right now. So you want to empower them to try and stay on the developmental course that they would have been on prior to the death. So if they were planning to leave home after high school to pursue college or travel or go into the Army, encourage them to try and stay on that developmental course and help them advocate for themselves. But they do take on adult worries and adult roles much earlier than their non-bereaved peers, as do kids in the younger stages as well. Younger ages, okay. All right, so interventions that help with this first goal on your treatment plan: avoid using euphemisms for death. Use the word died with them, because it signals to them that it's okay for them to talk to you about it, that you're not afraid to hear what they have to say about the death that they experienced. Even things like what their person looked like in the casket and what it was like being at the bedside or not being at the bedside when their person was dying, like what's happening for people now if loved ones are dying in ICUs. So use the real word for death rather than those euphemisms. Okay. When we have to talk about suicide with younger children, they don't understand what suicide means and may have trouble with their narrative about suicide. So what we've learned from kids is, or we know from all human beings, is that we're all storytellers, and we need to help kids find the words to tell their story, even if the death is due to some of the more stigmatized types of deaths, suicide being one of those. And so we want to take the stigma out of it. And first, when someone ends their life, they are most often suffering from a disease on the inside. And if we explain that to a child, that their person was suffering from a disease on the inside, it takes away some of that stigma. And that disease is most often a disease in their brain called depression. And that's true statistically. So, we give children choices of how they can answer the question, how did your person die? Because inevitably that's something that kids need to be able to talk about. It needs to be part of their story of their life. Well, my dad died, my brother died, my mom died, and she died from suicide, or she ended her own life. And we want to help them with that narrative. Okay. So some choices might be she ended her own life, she died from suicide. And younger children tend to latch on to, she died from depression. That seems to be one that for them, I've seen very often they like that explanation, which is true. It's part of the story. And maybe they're getting that more from their grown-up, that their grown-ups are more comfortable with that part. But it is true. And they can add the other parts later as they get older. We do have a rule at our house, FYI, that all children in our program need to know the cause of death. So, because we want to be there to help them process their thoughts and feelings about that while they're with us, rather than when they find out some other time in the future and don't have a grief support program to support them. Okay, we have to go on. Homicide is another tough one. Sometimes people don't like to talk about that, but there's some choices for you of what kids will say for their narratives. Okay, we'll go on. Substance-related deaths also can be stigmatizing, but are also caused from a disease on the inside. In the DSM-5 substance use disorder, it's a little hard for kids to say. They find it easier to say died from addiction or taking too much medicine is one that feels good, manageable to them. So again, we're not telling them what to say. We're helping them find what feels manageable but is still true. Okay, and lastly, for COVID-related deaths, this is a new disease. It's a disease that we don't have treatment for yet. There's no vaccine for it. Their person caught this disease that's a virus or a germ. Some families are calling it the germ, but it's very, very contagious. And you know, and the problem was that when your person got it, there was no treatment for it because medical professionals have not created a treatment that makes that disease go away yet. And that is why he died. Okay, let's go on. Okay, some activities really quickly. We mentioned the Trika and Sam books. Here's some other books. If you download the slides, you'll have these names for some other books here, and we'll show you some drawings that you can encourage your clients to do. We always ask them to draw how their person died, and that helps them talk about it if they draw it first. So let's go through a few. How did your person die? There's a heart attack drawing. The first one was the father hung himself. Here's another girl's heart attack on the treadmill. And then where they draw a picture of the funeral or memorial service, this was a funeral drawing. And then where is your person now? So we don't tell people what to believe, but we ask them, where do you think they are now? And just let them share with us their beliefs, if they have a belief about an afterlife or not. So that's a typical one. Here's another, where is your person now? Okay. Okay, all right. All right, Talia, let's do number 2.
All right, so Lauren took us through task 1 and the goals that are associated with task 1, which is really thought-based, understanding-based. And with goal 2 and task 2, we're now talking about feelings as well. So processing the pain, processing those grief feelings that come up after someone dies. So we've listed here the top feelings that are associated with grief when we talk to our kids and our teens: sadness, anger, fear, relief or happiness, and guilt. So for the sake of time, I'll go through them quickly, and next time in November, we'll go a little bit more in depth on how we work with each of these feelings. I think sadness needs no introduction. I think it's such a human feeling we can all understand. When we ask kids and teens in our program, what happened right after you found out that your person died, which is a question we ask in our intake, 9 times out of 10, the answer is, I started crying, right? That sadness sets in quickly and intensely, and that's something we hear quite often. Anger, there are different layers to who they could be angry at or who they're angry with. We sometimes hear they're angry at the doctors for not being able to save their parent or their sibling who died. Maybe they're angry with the surviving parent. Maybe they didn't do enough to help, or maybe now, like Lauren said, the fun one's gone, the fun parent's gone. Now you aren't being what I need right now. And sometimes they're angry at the parent who died. Maybe they feel they didn't take good enough care of their health and that's why they died. Or maybe there was a more, like Lauren mentioned, a couple narratives that they're still wrapping their head around from suicide or homicide, and they're placing blame in those cases as well. The last type of anger that we hear is anger towards themselves, and that can quickly turn into guilt, which we'll talk about a lot more in November. That is one of the most complicated feelings to help a child process. The cliff notes for today: when you hear guilty feelings from kids and teens, a rule of thumb to avoid is, and if we were in person, I'd have you all shout this out, but it's not your fault, right? That's something we're gonna completely avoid and take out of our repertoire. It quite quickly breaks that therapeutic alliance, or even as a parent, that breaks that connection that they understand, because the response is quickly gonna be, well, I just told you I think it is my fault. So you're not understanding, or you're not connecting with me on what that is and what I'm actually trying to communicate. So instead, what we would encourage you to do is try and trace back the guilty feeling to the thought that's creating that feeling. Where are there holes in their thinking or illogical thoughts that are creating that guilt? And that's where you want to start. And we'll share a lot more examples in November that really dig deeper into how to work with guilt. Fear, the most common fear we hear when talking to kids and teens is that either the surviving parent will die or someone else close to them will die. And you can imagine, with COVID now being highly contagious and at the forefront of the minds and thoughts of our families, that fear is really heightened now, that perhaps someone's going to catch COVID-19, and what does that look like? And we've heard that a lot from our group members. Relief can come up when, thank you, hello. Grief can come up when, there's been a prolonged illness, and now finally maybe someone's not in pain, or there's some relief associated with that. And happiness, maybe the surviving parent now used to be the primary caregiver of the other parent who died, and now there's more availability to care for the child. So activities that have to do with goal 2, right? Lots of feeling-based activities. A feeling ball, which you might have seen, you write feelings around it, toss it around, wherever your thumb lands, use that word in a sentence about your grief. One that translates really well to a virtual platform is creating a feelings pie. So you'll have your group member or your client you're working with draw a circle with an anchored dot in the center, and then correspond feelings with colors to visually show and map what feeling they're having and how much of that feeling they're having. Same with the feeling soup. This works great for littles, right? Sad carrots, scared beans, and visually mapping what feelings they have and to what extent that feeling is showing up for them. And you can give them a time frame, maybe within the last week or the last month. All right.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes, so I'm going to tell you the third goal. This is more about like case management type things, helping them, just making sure they're getting all their needs met in their new life without that person who died. And so it's about secondary losses. Some of them I mentioned earlier, housing, healthcare, loss of income, but also things like, are they in a new home now because they had to move because of the loss of income, new school, having to make new friends, new after-school program. We need to prepare kids for special days, like the birthday of the person who died, at the anniversary date of their death. For holidays, every holiday, every year from then on is tough for these kids. And so we need to make the educators understand it's not just year one, it's every year. And that, this doesn't go away, and there's no such thing as the grief card. All the COVID specific losses, the kids, the school day is filled with coping strategies for children when they're in person that they don't have right now. Very often the person who's supporting them most is the non-bereaved professional at school. That's the adult that they're talking to the most. And right now, they might not get to talk to any non-bereaved adults other than when they're getting their lesson, you know, in math. They might not get that one-on-one with the school counselor or get to stop in and talk to their math teacher at nutrition like they used to about their grief. They also don't have as much distraction as they usually get from their peers, you know, whether it's at the park, you know, after school or at recess when they got to play with each other. So that lack of distraction, you know, they have to do these drive-by birthday parties instead of having actual play dates, and, you know, all these distractions that used to help them with their grief are gone. And so they're stuck at home with all these reminders of the deceased. But I want to tell you, we're also hearing it's not all doom and gloom. A lot of our family members are telling us, oh, one more minute. They're also telling us that in some families, they've gotten closer. They're spending more quality time together, doing things they wouldn't normally have done, like board games, you know, watching movies together. They've gotten pets, pet rescues. You know, that there have been some positive things too, and grown closer with surviving family members than they had been previously. So it isn't just this doom and gloom scenario.
So maybe should we pause, Lauren, for questions and pick up the rest in November? Or how do you?
Let's just show them what the last goal is.
Okay, so goal 4, we'll jump in really quickly, is to maintain that bond and find ways to memorialize their person who died. So we see, you know, a real positive is engaging in ongoing rituals, like Lauren mentioned, special days or holidays, or even if you're a therapist working with a child, you can help them set up a space or a box to contain those memories or those rituals. We'll see our group members over time become more future oriented. So in the beginning of their time with us, they're reflecting a lot on the past and what has happened and their story. And then we see a shift. I'm going to be doing this in the future. I'm going to school. I want to be this when I grow up. And that helps us indicate that they're really finding ways to memorialize and honor their person while still moving forward. And the last point we really want to underscore with goal 4 is how resilient kids are. And for everyone on this screen who works with children, I'm sure you know this and I don't need to say it, but something fascinating that's pretty consistent across the research in this field is that 85 to 90% of kids who are bereaved as children go on to live perfectly beautiful, healthy lives with absolutely no residual trauma. And really, they don't go on to develop depression or anxiety solely because of that experience and that death. And there are sometimes, you know, 2 specific causes of death that can lead to developing anxiety, depression, or PTSD following the death. And those 2 are when someone close to a parent has died by suicide or from cancer, for 2 very different reasons, which we'll get into a lot more in November. But just know that kids are resilient. The support that you all are giving to them matters and is meaningful. And we've seen a lot of growth following that trauma. All right, maybe we'll zoom forward here. A couple activities, right? This is from Glee, a TV show where we are now not in person to be able to make those memorials at school or things like that. But Lauren mentioned earlier the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and they have an online memorial center where you can create one for someone in your community. We touched a bit on these. One thing I want to mention how amazing it is to be on Zoom is that kids are right there with their items and their special memories that they can show. And that's something I encourage you all to lean into. Have them grab a linking object and show that to the screen. It's pretty powerful. Okay. We'll end here on some coping skills, because this feels like a place to really contain our experience together. There's a list. You've seen most of these before. I want to teach one really briefly. It just takes a couple of seconds that we can end with. I know today you're inundated with grief and talking about grief, so hopefully you're finding time for yourself. But if you take your hands and place your palms towards your chest, and I can only see a few of you. Thank you, Leora, for joining in as well. and you place your thumbs right there on your collarbone. This is called butterfly breathing. And you breathe in slowly, deep, big, deep breaths. And as you do, you flutter your butterfly wings, is what we tell our kids. And as you do that, it helps ground yourself in your breath and into your body, and can be a nice way to contain the end of a session with a group member, or even for yourself after today's long, multiple sessions. Find time for yourself and take care of yourself as well, and each other. All right, Leora, we will hand it to you for Q&A. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Talia and Lauren. We have a couple more minutes, and I just want to lift. There's one concrete question that came up and one larger question. So the concrete question I'm hoping you just put in the chat box, which is that when you mentioned the word toolkit at the very beginning, people were like, yeah. So if you can please, I don't know what sound that is, but if you can please put where folks can find your school personnel toolkit in the chat box, that would be fantastic. The larger question is, what is your advice for parenting education around communicating to their children about death and dying? And so the specific question was, how do we navigate if a parent has lied to a child? And is it important to being honest? And we did hear, yes, important, not only honest, but direct and concrete. But I'm just curious if maybe Lauren or Talia, you could just share like a one sentence about where folks can get more parenting education support. That would be helpful.
Well, I think the important thing to share with them is it's never too late to be honest. That they can always go back and just say they were too overwhelmed at the time of the death, and that they'd like to tell them, more about what happened now, and then ask for their forgiveness. That people make mistakes and they're very sorry, but they want to tell them now what happened at the time, and it's better late than never. It's very straightforward. It's really not more than that.
Thank you, Lauren. We have maybe one more question and then we'll close out. So stick with us so I can give folks direction for closing. But do you have like a little bit of information about how to handle confidentiality concerns in grief support groups online? Like 30 seconds.
You want to take that, Talia?
Sure. I mean, a lot of unknowns are there. We can only see a certain amount on the screen, and it's hard to know really where the child is and who's hearing. We often suggest wearing headphones, so at least the folks that are on the screen, their confidentiality is being protected based on whoever's on the receiving end. And we talk a lot about it. So I think that's the biggest piece, being really open about how confidentiality feels different, especially with our teens. We can have really open conversations about that, but even with littles, and recognizing that if they're in a place where they can't be alone because they live in a home where that's the case, headphones protects everyone else, and then they are now aware that what they're saying can be heard by other family members. So we just really are open about those conversations, and we encourage the grown-ups at each reminder email and text, like Lauren mentioned, we remind them about confidentiality. It's really at the forefront of our communication, both with the kids and with the adults.
But we've also had to be more flexible with that too. We see grandmas with laundry walking through the room, and things like that just happen sometimes. And we're just glad the kids are together in the room sometimes. That's better than not at all.
Would help to unmute myself. Taking a deep breath. I think that everyone here has offered massive gratitude in the chat box. Please do feel free to put your gratitude to Talia and Lauren. It was a really beautiful and rich conversation. Talia, if you can move the slide forward, I want to do a couple sentences about what is coming up. So the recording and the decks will be up on our event website in the next week. I'm gonna, oh yes, Talia, if you could include the link to the toolbox as that's happening. And we'll also make sure that all the resources get put up on our resource page as well. I'm
not sure that there's a link available. I think it would be reaching out to Carolyn
I was just going to look for it, but my screen is shared. Is it possible for us to send you a PDF of it and include it with our slide deck?
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly what we'll do.
Let's
So
do that.
they'll put the toolkit information in the deck, and then we'll upload the PDF next week to the platform. That's great. If you can move forward, Talia. So I just want to please remind you, you'll get these links at the end of today. If you can scan for GIPRA, scan for your evaluation so that you can provide a couple, it takes 5 minutes, some feedback for the session. Every single evaluation helps us provide no cost conferences. So please do that. And you can also always copy and paste the evaluation into your browser, and you'll be able to fill it out that way. I am going to one more time. Oh, Livia is letting us know that the scan code is not working. So don't scan it. Just use, use the website. Thank you for letting us know. If you go ahead, Talia. So I just want to do a couple things of what's coming up next. There are 3 breakout discussions for you to be off mute or share a listening from this session or any of the concurrent sessions. So I just put the links in the chat box. You're welcome to join any. It doesn't have to be evidence-based, doesn't have to be school, doesn't have to be grief sensitive. You can join any of them. And tomorrow we open at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Do not make me do the math. 9 a.m. Pacific time and all the iterations, opening our day tomorrow. And we've got two more rich sessions and as well with breakouts. And just like Lauren and Talia were saying in the chat box, if you fill out the evaluation, they're coming back for our November practice, which is more applied. So please let us know what you would like to learn in November so we can continue our learning. So with that, I am going to invite you. We are ending just like Talia did. Feel free to end out. I'm going to put the links one more time. And then if Andrea can, I don't know, Andrea, if you're able to pull the evaluation link to put it in the chat box. But again, we're moving in about 15 minutes. We'll open for closing day breakout discussion sessions. You're very, very welcome to join us. You're also welcome to not join us. Go on a walk and drink water and do all the things. But we really welcome you to take some sort of pause moment between this conversation and the next thing you're doing. And on behalf of the MHTTC, we're so grateful, Talia and Lauren, to your sharing, to your wisdom, to you being vulnerable about your learning curve and that boulder that you were carrying. And hopefully the boulder feels different, but with more hands on it, Not maybe heavier, but just more hands. So with that, we're going to close. And again, we appreciate you so much. We will see some of you in the breakouts, hopefully all of you back with us tomorrow and again in November. Thank you so much.